So kind of looking at the calendar for where we stand today, remember for today, the plan is to kind of get going on 1.4. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today is lesson 1.4. I think a number of you have already gotten ahead and actually worked through, and some of you finished lesson 1.4 yesterday. For anybody that went through it, you saw it was a really simple chapter. There's really not too much in 1.4. It's to the point where, I've strongly considered just dropping this chapter, but there are a handful of things that are maybe worth talking about that are in this chapter. So I am going to kind of be going over some of those topics. So the topic, if you've looked at the reading material, you'll see that in lesson 0.44, it's really just a bunch of links. That's really all that's in the reading material up on Perusal. This is a bunch of links to other further reading material. There's very little in that actual chapter. But there's a little bit more that's in the lab that isn't necessarily in the reading material. Some other concepts. So some of the stuff I'll be talking about here that I want to kind of look at and point to is some things that are on the lab but not on the test. I mean, not on the reading. So I've got kind of my own notes that I've put about. So things we'll be talking about today, we'll be talking about launcher icons, how to work with those. We'll be talking about some of the activity templates there, the sample projects, the Android developer documentation, and take a quick look there. And then one thing on the Android developer documentation I want to point you to specifically is the quality checklist, which is a really helpful thing to look at and definitely a page to bookmark. Okay, so I've got my own kind of sets of notes, and I'm going to be working off of that today. If you do want a copy of this, I'm going to go ahead and link it, add it in Discord, and this is kind of my centralized, like, hey, here's the things we want to talk about. So one of the first tasks you get to, I think it's task 2 on the list when you work through the 1.4 code labs. One of the first things that it'll ask you to do is to go through and add a launcher icon to an app you previously built. And specifically, it's going to ask you to take your Hello Toast project that we built in 1.2, copy it over to 1.4, and put a new icon on there. Okay. So what it is going to ask you to do is going to show you, as you walk through this, how to use the tooling, how to use what's built directly into Android Studio to make an icon. Okay, which we can totally do, and I'll walk through that process just because I want to maybe make sure that we pay attention to some things there. So I'm going to walk through that process here. If you, obviously, some of you have already done this on your project, that's fine. But I do want to call some things to attention and kind of walk through it. The other thing I will mention is more often than not, we don't do this process. The process that they've got here in the instructions for this task is not usually what we do. Okay, because what they're telling you how to do is how to use an icon that basically Google's already made and created, and is generally, it's from this list of icons, from this list of material icons that kind of already have a purpose, right? Usually when you're making an icon from your application, you're not going to be using one of those pre-built icons. Usually it's going to be one that's, say, your brand logo, or it's going to be one that another, a designer has created. So large in part, you're going to get that and start with it as either a PNG file or an SVG file to start with. The preferable of those two is always an SVG file. It's always preferable to start with an SVG image over starting with the PNG. And what that means is that really when we make launcher icons, actually the process is much more similar to what we did with the PWAs. Where usually what you do is you have your designer is going to go make an icon in either Adobe Illustrator or Inkscape, make that SVG file, make it square, make it 5 by 12, and then we'll do some processing from there to turn it into the assets that we actually need and use. Okay, so that's actually what usually happens. So I do want to talk a little bit about how do we do that process, because these steps don't really tell you how to do that. Okay, but that's usually what happens. Okay, next thing we'll talk about, and so let's kind of walk through here. So when you start and make a new application, every application in Android, every project you create gets a default icon. Okay, and that icon has evolved a little bit over the years in terms of what the default icon is when you create a new project. I think if you look down here, you can kind of see this icon. I think at some point that used to be the default, but generally speaking, when you create a new project, it looks like this, right? It's a little Android icon on top of it, circled with a kind of gridded background to it. That's what you get when you start a brand new project. Okay. So we can look at that. We can look at how that's put together, and we can look at how we change that. It's worth mentioning that depending on the particular Android device that you're working with today, some will show these icons as squares and some will show them as circles. By virtue of that, we actually have to make two icons, basically, for any Android apps that we ship. We have to ship a square icon as well as a circular icon. Now, what they've done in this specific, in the starter setup, is they split up that foreground and the background. So basically, if you're using a square icon, it uses more of that background, right? So the foreground, you don't want to get cut off, and basically the foreground has to fit into that circle, but the background can stretch. The background is the part that you're okay with losing part of it. Cool? Okay, so let's look at Android Studio, and we'll kind of go there. Another mention on here, I really wish they hadn't done this, but you might notice if they say, okay, let's talk about icons. Oh, and before we do that, go look at the Android documentation. I really wish they hadn't stuck this in here, because it becomes really easy to skip, and it's maybe not a good time to look at it. So I'm actually going to come back and talk about that last, because it's kind of a weird place to put it in. All right, so when I make a project, and maybe I'm going to go, really doesn't matter what project I go to, so maybe I'll go back to the login screen project that we started. If you want to start a brand new clean project, if you're trying to follow along with this process, that's fine, or use whatever you have available to you. So I'm going to go to, where do I have that located at? So C, users, Paul Smith, Android Studio projects. There's my Hello Project Word project. Okay. So just save some time from creating a brand new project. I'm going to do it from this one. All right. So when I look at the icon that's already in there, let me just run this first on maybe the tablet emulator, and we can see what's already in place. So first things first is maybe to know where this icon appears, because it actually does appear in a good number of places. Okay, so I have the application running right now. If I hit the square icon, that's going to bring it down, and you can see it there. Well, let me actually kill any of the other applications I have running. Beep. All right, get that gone away. There we go. So you can see the icon appearing up on the top, right? So that appears when you go to Square, you go to the list of applications. So that's one way to indicate to your users, like, what application is this running in. Another thing to mention here, if I click on that icon, there's actually a menu that appears. This is on newer devices. Older devices didn't have this. We have options for app info, split screen, screenshot. If I go to application info, this is going to go to information about your application and settings, etc. The icon is going to appear here as well. Okay, so those are two places you're going to see the icons. Another place that you commonly see the icon, and this is where most users know about it, is if I go in here and I'm looking at all of those. Now you might notice a little of a problem here. You know, this is me from having tested your apps and your labs. Well, everybody's lab looks the exact same way. I've got 10 different Hello Toasts, one for each different student, right? I can do that because you all have different package names, but notice that the name of the app doesn't have to be unique, which means that icon is extra important to kind of set yourself apart. Because actually, that's actually usually how users identify your app is by the icon. So, what I want, so that appears there. If I take, say, one of these and drag it, hey, I've got it on a shortcut here. Let me find, where is the Hello World project specifically that we had running? Because I do believe this one is called Hello World. Boop. Huh. All right. Well, what is this name? Let me go to strings. Oh, I've called it test. Maybe I'm going to call this login screen just so I can identify it. There we go. Okay, so what's going to happen is once I change this icon, where'd it go now? Beep, beep, there. So once I change the icon on this application, it's going to change in all of those places, including going to change on my launcher. Okay, cool. So it's pretty important. So let's look at how that icon's being built right now. It starts up here, if I remember right, in the manifest. And so the first entry point, and let me turn the light off. So there are a few things you kind of have to be aware of, mainly from a troubleshooting standpoint, because it does come up. But let me start here. So the first place where the icon kind of starts and is referenced is actually here in the manifest. Okay, so you'll see in the manifest there's two lines that really kick this process off. We've got an application tag here. That application has an Android icon, and it also has a round icon. Those two properties tell it what files to use. Those two properties tell it what files to use. It says, use this file for the rectangular icon, which is just the Android icon, and use this icon for the round icon. Okay, so that's where that starts. Okay, so if you name the file something different than IC Launcher and IC Launcher Round, you're going to have to go back here and change that name. But that's also why it starts with that name. It's also why it prefers that name. And in fact, if we went through the process and go through the process in the lab, it's going to create a brand new file with that same name. Okay, so that's number one, is that's where the name or the reference to those icons are. So we start there. That refers to IC Launcher. You'll notice that it starts with @mipmap. Okay, so that means that, okay, well, what kind of resource is it? It's this mipmap sort of resource. All right, so I'm going to go over to the mipmap folder, and if you look under mipmap, you're going to find that there is, well, an IC Launcher and an IC Launcher Round, both of which were referenced in the manifest. Okay, if those didn't exist, your whole app would fail to build because the manifest is saying I have to have these things. Cool? Okay. So they're actually in there, and Android does require them for you to even run the app in the first place. If you do break these, the whole app breaks. So let's look at what's under IC Launcher Round, or IC Launcher to begin with. What you're going to see is there's this folder with a number. It looks very much like what we had with the layout variants, because there's variants of this icon. So when I expand, we're going to see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different variants of this particular launcher icon. Okay, you can see that 5 of these variants are WebPs. Okay, they used to actually be PNGs when you created a new project, but now Google switched those over to the WebP format. And then we've got an XML file. Okay, modern devices only use this, really only need this XML file. Those other WebP or PNG files are only there for older devices, just so we're clear. Those are only needed for older devices, and we really prefer to do that one. Okay, so if you look at the part that's at the end, you might see that there's a little thing in parentheses that says which variant is this, kind of like how we had the default, which is portrait, the additional, which is landscape, and the version was for tablet. It's the same idea. So we have a high DPI, medium DPI, extra high DPI, extra high DPI, and extra high DPI. That's what those abbreviations are for. The last one you'll see says any DPI dash version 26. Okay? So that one works, that XML file works on literally any DPI. You only need one version. That's part of the benefit of using an XML file. The downside is those XML files are only supported on version 26, which is why it says version 26. As long as your device is running on API 26 or higher, it will use that. And because when we created this project, we gave it a minimum API of 24, it said, okay, well, what's supported on 24? Well, on 24, it supports WebP, and later on, some of those devices will support SVGs or support that XML file. So it made the WebPs for 24 and 25, and the XML file for 26 on, basically. So that XML file takes on for any of your newer devices. Another reason why it really matters, what's your minimum API to start with, because it influences things like this. Cool. If we look at the individual files in here, what you're going to see is that they're all really the same image. The only difference between these 5 different WebPs is they're slightly different sizes. There's slightly more pixels in it. So as we go up in the range, MDAPI would be the lowest one, HDPI is the next, and then kind of going from there. So it's really just making these different layout variants, which is kind of like what we did with the, remember when we built the PWA. We started with a 512 by 512, and we just made some smaller versions of that icon. Well, how big is the highest resolution image here? How many pixels in size is that one? If I look at the top corner, 192 by 192. So we got a 192 by 192, 144, 96, 72, and a 48, right? So basically all we need to do, as far as to meet and make all those variants, we need to start with an image that's 192 by 192 or bigger, and make sure that it's square, and then I can just make all those smaller versions, which it turns out that's part of what Android Studio helps you with. If you start with a 512 by 512, it will make all those smaller versions for you. Cool. Also helps if you have an SVG, because an SVG will also give us this XML file. So if we start with an SVG, we can just run it through, and it'll make all of these variants for us. Cool. Which is basically what we're doing. So we look at that. We look at the XML file at the end. All right, look real quick. This XML file, okay? This XML file says it's an adaptive icon, right? You can see the adaptive icon on the outside. So it's saying, hey, this is an icon that can adapt to different sizes. There's inside of that, there's two tags. There's a background and a foreground. And so basically what this XML file is doing is it's putting two images together and making that the icon. Okay, so the background refers to a resource. So it refers to drawable IC Launcher background, okay? And the foreground refers to drawable IC Launcher foreground, okay? So the actual code for this icon is not in this file. You can see that, right? The actual code for the icon is not in this file, it's just in direction. So the real code for this file is actually over here in the drawable folder, not in the bitmap folder. So if I look over here, all right, this is the background, and what you can see is that it's a vector tag at the top. So this is what we call a vector image, and within there's a bunch of paths. Those paths are the instructions to draw those individual lines, okay? This file is almost identical. If you've ever looked at the code inside of an SVG, it's almost identical to this SVG syntax. In fact, you can take an SVG and convert it to this using Android Studio. That's really what this is, basically. This is an SVG file to draw the background. Okay. Let's look at the foreground. Foreground, same idea. Okay, it's a vector tag out at the outside with some instructions for how to draw this icon. So that's what we're actually seeing, is it's putting these two vector images together. So basically, our icon, that default launcher icon, at least as we're starting out, is just two SVG stock turned on top of each other. That's basically what modern icons look like. Okay, it used to be that you made, hey, here's a bunch of different PNG versions for the different sizes, but today this is the direction we're going. We just have SVG files. Now, if I look at the round icon, we're going to see a similar sort of thing, right? Difference being, here we've got squares with rounded edges. Here we've got a circle, right? That same idea. So there's a bunch of different versions again, highest one still being 192 by 192, right? The difference between this one and that one is really you're just losing the corners, right? Which is usually all we do, right? Between the square and the round versions, we just lose the corners. If I look at this one, we'll also see that there's an adaptive icon here, and it's actually using the same foreground and background. Cool. So there's actually really no difference between these two files. IC launcher launcher.xml, IC launcher round.xml. There's actually no code difference between those two files. Everybody clear with that? Because all it's doing is just chopping off the edges. So as things go forward, today we're still adding these PNG files. Once we get to a point where, hey, the only devices on the market is 26 or higher, well, we can just forget about creating these versions. It's just going to be some SVG files. Okay, so that's kind of what has to be there in order for things to work. Now, oftentimes I find if I want to make a new icon, the first step to do is to delete the old icon. Because unfortunately, when you create a new icon, when you use the steps that they tell you in Android Studio, sometimes your project will fail to build because it didn't actually clean things up properly. Okay, so the best thing to do is step one, if you're going to change the icon, is first to delete the old icon. So that just means I go in here in the bitmap, I'm going to delete IC Launcher. Yep, delete anyway, delete IC Launcher Round, delete anyway, and then in drawable, I'm going to delete both the foreground and the background. Cool. So I have nothing left in drawable and bitmap. I need to delete all of those resources to begin with. Cool. Everybody good with that? Okay. So let's say I want to create a new icon now that I've gotten rid of that one. It's worth mentioning here, you'll see these are red now. The manifest is still referring to both of these icons, but they don't exist anymore. Okay, so I can't actually run the project and test it at this point until I give it a new icon. All right, so I'm going to go right click on drawable, and I'm going to go to new. Okay, there's a whole lot of options here. Okay, and so what I'm going to pick is the second option down, which is a drawable resource file. Is that right? No, that's not what I want. I think I need to go to new image asset. I want, yeah, let's do image asset. You'll notice that there's an image asset and there's a vector asset. If you go to a vector asset, you're strictly making vector icons that only work on API 26 or higher. If you go to create an image asset, it's creating both the legacy and the new. So that's how we're getting this. Is we have to make sure that we create a image asset and not a vector assets. Okay. You'll notice on the drop down that there's some options. So this is set to launcher icons, adaptive and legacy. So it's telling us it's going to create both versions, and it's going to create this specifically for a launcher icon. Now, if we want to create some other kinds of icons, which we will want to do eventually here, you can go down and look at some of the other options. So, for instance, here, notice that there is an option here labeled action bar and tab options. Okay, so actually, in general, this is the one we use the most. Is we're actually going to go down here and create an icon. We use these icons for the start bar, for various other icons that you might use within your application. This is the most common usage, actually, of this dialog, is to add icons like this. And if we look, I can click the icon here, the clip art icon. Okay, it will take a minute to load, and it will give you all of these icons that are already in existence. And you'll notice that they kind of are there for standard things. So, like, let's say I want to make a Wi-Fi icon. I can look for Wi-Fi, and hey, there's some standard things. Like, there's signal, or there's no signal, right? So I can get some of these icons, their versions already built in, and start to play with things. So this is like the main way that we use this, first and foremost. Now, let me go back to the launcher. Okay, so launcher, you'll notice, is a little bit different, right? So if we're creating an icon that we're using in the application, it's a little bit different to how we create an icon that we use to launch the application, because there's different needs. Okay, so with launcher icon, you'll notice that there's a field for the name, right? IC_launcher. Okay, it's a field. You can change that name if you want to. It's technically allowed. Hint: don't change that name. Always call it IC launcher. It's actually a perfectly good name, and it's actually preferable to just stay with that name because it ends up working better with various tooling. So this is the name of what your icon will be. We're going to leave that as that. You'll see down there that there's a foreground tab and a background tab, right? Because remember, we have two different images that we're stacking on top of each other. So it's already picked those default ones that were there when we created the project, right? And if we went through this process and hit next and went through this again, you would just recreate all of those files that we just deleted, okay? But we want to actually make our own icon, right? So what I'm going to do is, with the foreground, a quick way to make an icon is you can start by saying, okay, let's pick clip art, and let's pick one of those images that is already there and available to us. So maybe what do I want to look for? Maybe I'll do this local dining icon, right? Okay, I can pull this in. Maybe I'm making a food app of some sort. You'll notice that the color by default is black. That may or may not be what you want, so let's make it white. So I'm going to go in here and change the color of that icon. Okay. There's also some icon options here, trim and resizing. This is definitely something to play around with, and you'll see as I kind of slide this slider, basically the icon gets smaller and larger. That's really something you have to play around with, especially when you're bringing in your own icon. You really have to adjust it to fit, and you actually still usually find that I need to do this even with some of the clip art, because sometimes the clip art's a little bit too big. So definitely play around and adjust that slider. Next thing is to jump over to the background layer. Okay. By default, it has this background image picked. I'm going to jump over and keep it simple. I'm going to go over to color and just use a solid color as my background. So maybe we go in there, make this some sort of pink or purple.
Wow, it shows the same color. What the heck?
And so very quickly, you can get to an icon like this. It'll actually give you all the variations. And this is all actually basically all the app that your lab is going to ask you to do. Right? So we've got that. I'm going to hit next, finish. You can now see that I've got a new file under IC Launcher foreground. If you didn't delete the old resources, you would still have that IC Launcher background. That's one of the things that it doesn't clean up for you, is it doesn't delete the old background. So if you don't do that, your Finder project doesn't compile. Okay, so we got that. We've got over here, you'll notice that there is an IC Launcher background, but it's under values instead of drawable. Okay, because it's brought it in as a color, because I said to use a color, that means it goes over here as a color resource versus not being an image. Okay, similar sort of setup as we had before. There's now a pair of bitmaps, both round and square, and you'll see it's putting these things together. So it's actually generated all of these PNG files that we needed, plus the individual XMLs, right? And if I try to run the application at this point, it should run, although it's complaining about missing a foreground. Foreground not found. Okay, so I'm going to go to build, I'm going to go to clean project, and I'm going to try and run it again. There it goes. I'm still trying to use the old thing. If I go back down, there's my nice icon, and I can even see it here. So swapping out the icon, basically the process is as simple as completely delete the old icon, and go to create a new image asset, and it basically that's it, right? Does that make sense? So that works as long as you want something like this. As long as you want an icon like this that takes one of the pre-existing clip arts and has a solid background. Okay. Most apps don't have that. Most apps, that's not what we do. Okay. So what do we do for most apps? We're not going to pick a clip art that's for most apps, we're not going to pick a clip art that's already available there, right? I'm going to have an icon that we made somewhere else. Okay, so the best way to kind of simulate what we would actually do is to go out and to find an SVG. Okay, so let's say I want to find one of those. Flat icon is one of those places that I found a lot of these. Unfortunately, I can't get SVGs from free. You can get a PNG, and you can go that way, but I don't get an SVG. So let's say I want to start with an SVG. I think I created one at the beginning here a few weeks ago. I just cannot remember where I put that one. So let's see. Where did I put that icon? Oh, actually, I see it there. So I had created when we did the PWA example, I'd made this icon using Inkscape. Okay, so I'm actually going to hijack this one and use it to make my icon for Android. Got it? Because it's basically the same process. So I'm going to throw the assets that I have here. I'm going to throw this SVG file onto Discord. So if you're trying to follow along, you'll have the same file. There's the SVG, and also throw the PNG in there as well. Okay. So these are the icons that I'm starting with. Okay. Let me open up the first one in Inkscape. So no, before I do that, I'm going to go back here. So we walked through how to do it with an icon that I picked from the clip art. I'm going to delete the files here. So I'm going to say, let's delete IC Launcher foreground. Yep, delete anyway. I'm going to delete the two things under the bitmap folder. Delete anyway. Delete anyway.
Oh, you moved the whole folder.
The whole group of variations. Yeah. So I just said, hey, we don't want any of those variants anymore. All right, so I'm back to the point where I don't have any laid out resources. I've cleared things out from values, bitmap, and drawable, which was where all of those things were. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to say new, go back into image asset, but I'm going to pick some different options this time. And this is where it's going to be this is where it's going to behave differently. So under the foreground, I'm going to keep that same name, IC Launcher. I'm going to pick the asset type, but I'm going to go pick my file that I had created myself. So for me, that's on my desktop. So I need to just track that down, desktop directory, and look for logo SVG. There we go. So I brought in my SVG file. Any problems? Anything immediately pops out? Notice my icon isn't really centered. So I immediately have maybe a problem. I think I can shrink it down a little bit, right? So I can change the size. Oop. And do have to be careful there because I ran out of memory. So I don't think that there's a way for me to drag it per se.
It's like you make it bigger and smaller, but
yeah, but it seems like it's centered down here.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't remember this happening last time that I did this. So more than likely what I'm going to have to do is go back into Inkscape, and I'm probably going to have to modify this file a little bit. So what I'm going to do, Inkscape, I'm going to open this file up, and I have a suspicion as to what I need to do. So where can I go? Existing files. All right, I'm just going to go to new document and open it once the thing gets there. So file, open, go to my desktop, grab the logo.svg. There, I've got it open. My guess is that Android Studio is expecting the origin to probably be at the center of the icon. Whereas like the origin, I think, is this bottom left corner. So my guess is if I take this and kind of shove it down here, file, save as, I'm going to call this logo2.svg. Now try it again. Boop. Logo2 SVG. Anything? Nope. Still not there. So push it down. Let me take all of it, shove it back over to the other corner. Save it. Try it again. Still nothing.
No,
So
the one you shared on Discord looked just fine.
it did?
Oh yeah, you take a look here. And it's set to default 100%.
Oh, but you started with the PNG.
That's what you sent us.
I sent both the SVG and the PNG.
Oh, you sent
They're
both?
both up there.
Oh, I see.
So let me. So that's interesting. So it's not liking my SVG either way. Okay. So what I'm going to do is then, yeah, I'll just go to the PNG. So if I go to the PNG here, it seems to not have that same problem. I can kind of scale it up. You might notice in the preview that there's a little circular border. So I can try to basically line that up with where my line is. So it's going to land right on it. There. Unfortunately, it doesn't line up perfectly on those other ones. So oftentimes I may need to go back to the designer if I have something like this and have them create two separate files. Like one might be, hey, I need to actually get rid of the rounded border around it so that I can have that done differently. So let's say I do this, bring that icon in. I'm going to go to the background layer. This can either be that color or that can be the image. Can I turn this here? See if I can do that little dropper. Get that same shade of green, maybe, or maybe I just do black. Yeah, maybe I just do black. So it's possible to bring in another image if you have another image file. Again, that usually would be an SVG or a PNG as well. So I'm going to bring that in. And is there anything else I need to do here? Yeah, no, I think that's it. So that's usually what this process would look like. It'd be maybe a little bit different. You'd pick from an image here, and you might pick from an image or a color there. I think that I thought there was a way to turn the background off entirely, but I'm not seeing it. Huh? You said what?
If you have a background and you change the color to white, then you'll do the background.
It's still there.
Oh, yeah.
It's not gone away.
Yeah, you have to do like a clear PNG.
They'd have to be clear, yeah, and so they don't have an option here to have no background. So that's kind of interesting that there's not that option. What I could do is if I go to, I think if I went into here, I think potentially I could turn off or comment out that background layer. I'm kind of curious what happens if I try to comment this layer out and try to run it here. Although we're looking at looking at the rounded version. I'm going to comment both of those out and try to run it and see what happens. As a curiosity. So it seems like it worked. I'm not sure. I'll go back. Yeah. So either way, the process is usually that you're starting with a file that's actually as maybe a PNG to begin with and bringing it in. But you might notice there, like there are some things you have to kind of go back and forth with. So oftentimes when you're doing that new image asset, you'll notice how maybe my image was a little bit off center. So because it's off center, there's a little bit more border down here and there. And so those are things you may have to go back and forth with your designer to get right. Or you may oftentimes have to do things in an image editor itself to get it prepped to be used here, right?
So this thing is really just taking an image and making multiple copies of it in different resolutions, right?
Basically, that's all that this is doing, right? Basically, that's all that this is doing.
Okay.
This is not usually where the process starts. This is usually where the process ends. So that's kind of a common misconception is that, oh, I can just use this, but it's like, well, it's one part of the process, but it's not usually the whole thing. So that's how I get my icons. Okay. Next up. So next topic that we want to talk about is these templates. Okay. So when you start, remember when you start a project, right? We had one question that asked us. It asked us, which activity template do we want to use, right? You may remember that question. It's also worth mentioning once we've already started a project, it's possible to add more activities. So if I go, say, here where I've got my code, I can say new and go down to here. Everybody see where I'm hovering? So I say new activity, okay, specifically new activity. You go down here and we can say, let's click on gallery, okay? So you can actually add more activities later, right? So you start out with one activity, you can add as many activities as you want, okay? Every time you add a new activity, you get this choice of which template you want to use, okay? Which template you want to use to create that new activity. The idea around these different templates is to give you some pre-built code, some additional code to start with, so you don't have to necessarily write all of that yourself, okay? My experience, I don't use these anymore, and I barely ever use them ever. They aren't that helpful. They really are not that helpful. The idea was, again, to try and reduce the amount of code that you have to write. My experience has been, more often than not, they don't add much, right? So usually they're adding, hey, click this, add a bunch of other classes, and hopefully those classes are good, and you're fine, but these don't get updated very often. So there actually has been a history of these having bad practices in them, just a heads up, right? There has been a history of some of these templates having not so good ideas in them. The other thing that's happened over the years is they've changed. I've run this class a few years now. 5 years ago, these templates used to generate a certain code. Now they generate different code, which has always caused problems when they made that change. So it also, because that code is changing, it makes it really hard to rely on them as being like, I know what's going to happen when I click that button. So I would really strongly suggest, if you're doing any Android development whatsoever, empty activity is the only one you should be using today. All the others are not worth the effort. Now, where are they useful? Basically, these are all sample projects. That's the way to think about it. So when you're adding an activity to a project that's already existing, you should always use empty activity. The only place where you want to use these templates is when you're potentially creating a new project. That's the case where these are more helpful. Okay? So when I'm creating a brand new project, I'm going to close this project and start a new one. Okay. At this point, when I'm starting a brand new project, this is where it might be worth looking at, maybe I'm going to start with an activity that is closer to the application I'm trying to build, right? If you're starting completely blank slate, that is the only time I would ever consider using anything other than empty activity, okay? Which also means, hey, if you want to test this out, the best thing to do is create a brand new project with that template, take a look at the code. If it's something that you like, then you can bring that code over to your project that you're working on. Cool? That's the way I would recommend doing these, is think of these other templates as sample projects, okay? As sample projects. So one of these activities that's kind of an obvious one is basic activity, okay? This used to be one that over time, about midway through this class, I actually switched my students over and said, hey, rather than starting creating every new activity with empty activity, let's create it with basic activity because it sets a few things up. Unfortunately, it's not as good at doing that anymore because they changed and it doesn't do the things that I liked about it anymore. So, enough said. So let's try basic activity because that's one of the things that the lab is going to ask you to do. I'm not going to worry too much about what I call this, so I'm just going to call this maybe basic activity as the name of the app. I'm going to put this under the 1.4 folder with a name of basic activity, no space. So 1.4 basic activity. I'm going to create this project. So really the only difference here is I've used that basic activity template instead of the empty activity template. Now, unlike the empty activity template, remember empty basically had barely anything in main activity. Notice that there's a bunch of additional code in main activity. Okay, there's a bunch of additional code in main activity. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here. So, but several of these topics are lessons in and of themselves in terms of things that this has added. Which is where I would still recommend today to stick with that empty activity, because the empty activity isn't adding anything you don't understand yet. So let's look at the layouts. We might notice here, how many layouts did empty activity give us? 1. How many layouts do we have now? 4, right? Okay. If I try this application, we're going to find that this app kind of has the behavior of almost having 2 screens. So there's a bit more going on here. There's a part where I also say that this is more sample project and less template. Actually, I want to run this on the Nexus S because otherwise I can't really see what's going on there. It's too small. Okay, there we go. That's a lot easier to see. Okay, so the 2 big things that are here that are different and to call to your attention, which used to be part of the reason that I used to use this more often, is there is a FAD, down here we call it floating action button, and up on the top right you'll notice there's a triple dot. Okay, so we call that the options menu, and this is the floating action button for FAD. Also in the center here, there is something going on called a fragment, and it's got a next button on it that seems to take me to another screen, right? What's actually going on here when I hit next and previous is still actually staying on the same screen, the same activity. So it's actually switching the screen using something called fragments. Okay. The short explanation of what a fragment is it's like a mini activity, and that was the original intent of fragments, is they're little mini activities. They've actually been around since Android 11, but they've gone through a lot of evolution over the years. It's something that we really probably should take some time later on in the semester to talk about, because one of the things that's happening, and there's a shift, and this is part of why this template is way different, is because the whole mindset of how we develop Android apps is changing, okay, which is why this template looks different than it does in your lab assignment, which is why there's fragments here when there didn't used to be. So the original mindset, just to help you along and explain what's going on here, the original mindset is that every screen should be an activity, okay? What's happening today in Android development is we're actually shifting towards more of a model like React, okay? In the web development world, we got this idea of single page applications. And so both if you're building with React or you're building Angular, you're building with Vue, these are single page applications. The idea is you really only have one HTML file, but you use JavaScript to change and show the different screen, render the different pages. So that's what's happening in the web world, right? Well, why is that happening in the web world? It turns out there's a few reasons. And part of that is, first of all, our things are more dynamic, right? As part of that shift is happening. We've also learned how to make it more efficient. We've actually learned that we can make our websites more efficient by building single page applications rather than actually building multi-page applications. So because changing the HTML file that you're on is actually really costly and doesn't work well from animations, leads to poor user experience. So it's actually better in the web world to leave you on the same page, make it look like the URL is changing, make it look like there's actually different pages, which we did last semester with the Express router or React router package, right? We did that process, but we didn't actually change, we never actually changed pages, right? You did have to rebuild everything if you say maybe refreshed the page, right? Because then you had to tear the app got torn down, you had to build it back up. But it's this idea that we really only have one page. The same thing's happening in the Android development space because it's actually come to the same set of problems. We've discovered at this point that it actually works better having everything in one activity and making it look like there's different screens, emulating that behavior. And so we're emulating that today basically with fragments. So we change the fragment, we don't change the activity.
So it's kind of like how React works, kind of like the same application, but it just kind of looks like you're in.
Yeah, so it's the same idea. It's the same idea with React and React Router, where it looks like there's multiple pages to the user's perspective, even though there's only one screen, even though there's one activity. So that's just to fill you in. That's part of what's happening here, is that this is one activity, but a fragment for each page. Which also means this is not a good starting point if you're not in that model already, right? In fact, if you were going to go down this route, this main activity would be the only activity in the entire application. So again, why I wouldn't want to say, oh, let's just make another basic activity because, well, I don't need another activity, right? If I was going to start here and I need another activity, I would make it as another empty activity because I need to rebuild up that structure. Okay, so what we're seeing in here is, let's talk about the layouts maybe first. Okay, I'm going to go to a split view so we can look at the code here. If we look at activity main, which is the starting point, kind of like it was the starting point with empty activity. You can see on the outside, there's not a constraint layout, there is a coordinator layout. This is weird, okay? In fact, your textbook doesn't talk about coordinator layout at all. But the shorthand answer of what this is about coordinating layouts. Coordinating not coordinating transitions, coordinating animations. That's what it's about. Coordinating things to kind of work together. Which again leads into major changes that are happening in the Android space. Okay, so on the outside here, we've got this coordinator layout. The next thing you'll see is there's an app bar layout. Okay, this app bar layout is actually replacing the normal action bar that you see up at the top with a custom action bar. And part of that goes down to old versions of Android didn't have a lot of support when it comes to the actual action bar. So to support all of these devices, what we've actually found out the best thing to do is to turn off the action bar completely and build our own. So that's actually what's happening here, is we're putting our own toolbar, application bar in and replacing the one that's built in with Android. So that's what's going to be up at the app bar. And I think if I look at this with System UI turned on, I don't think System UI is turned on. Can I go basic activity? No, it won't show me. It won't show me what it actually looks like. So it won't actually tell me what's going on there. Okay, so that's the app bar. You can see it's got app bar layout, and then inside of it, it's got a toolbar. Beneath that, it's got an include. Remember I talked about that include and how to use that with scroll views. So it's including another layout, content main, and then we've got finally the FAB, clothing action button, which has got button. Okay. So that's what's happening there. That's at the outer level. So then we can tell from the include, the next step down would be to go down and look at the content main. Now this gets really interesting. Look at what's in here. Not much. Okay. So there's a constraint layout, and inside of that constraint layout is a fragment tag. That's it. That's all that's in this layout. There's a constraint layout that's holding this fragment layout. To be honest, there's no reason that this needs to be a constraint layout. This actually would be better probably just being a frame layout, because it's literally only ever contains this frame, this fragment. We're saying all the content of this page is actually in this fragment. Okay. That fragment then points to something. Let's look at some of those properties. So a fragment, remember, is like a mini activity. So we're saying here in the layout, which actually turns out to be the whole layout, is this fragment tag set. We can see it's got an ID. We can see it's got this name. Now notice in the name we've got AndroidX.navigation.fragment.navhost.fragment. This navhost is part of the new system of navigation, right? Basically, it's a placeholder for a fragment, is the shorthand explanation of what's going on here. You can see that layout width is 0, 0, so it's expanded to be the full place. You can see that this is marked as the default nav post, where default nav post is true. The constraints is constrained to all 4 sides, and it points to something called a navigation graph. Okay. So again, all of this points to the very different way of building Android apps that's on the way in. Okay. It's the whole point of basic activity today is to get you started with that new development paradigm. Okay. I think you can see all the new there's a lot of new concepts right here. Right. So this is a hard place to start with where we are at today. This is something that if we can talk about it and explain it further, probably be halfway or more through the class before we're ready to really talk about this one fully. Okay. So that's kind of what's going on there. Is it's really just a placeholder for fragments, and there's two other layouts here: fragment first, fragment second. Both of these are constraint layouts, and so basically there's a layout for each fragment. Again, the fragments you can kind of think as the screens. So basically what all of that means is if you start a project with this basic activity template, it turns out you actually don't touch activity main and you don't touch content main. Actually, they're meant to be just left alone, right? That's largely code that you just kind of put in there. It's like, okay, I need a new fragment. I'll add a new layout for the fragment instead of a new layout for the activity. If I look at what's contained inside of main activity, you'll see a lot going on here. There are some variables up top. So we've got app bar configuration, which is related to that top bar. We've got this binding, which I don't want to really get into. We've got that binding being set up. We've got a call here to set support action bar, which is an important thing. This is part of how we get to replace the app bar that's built in with our custom thing, is basically what's happening. There's some setup for this nav controller, nav host bit. There's some binding that's finally happening. This function here, what that does on create options menu, this says, okay, there's a resource that we use to build that options menu. Use that to inflate and determine what is in the menu. And then this responds to when you click on something in said menu. And then we finally got something that deals with, again, this kind of navigation stuff. It's okay if this all looks foreign. It's going to all look foreign. This is part of where I don't recommend starting here right now. There's a lot of details in here even today because I'm not familiar with it. It's very new. I still gloss over a lot of these details. I look at what in the world is going on here. I wish there was an easier way to do things. This is also why this kind of stuff is also why I'm like, I think PWA might be the future because you don't have to deal with some of the weirdness that's happening in the Android world today. Anyway, so hopefully that maybe gives you some glimpse, a little bit of glimpse into what's going on here and why things are different. Again, part of it comes down to this whole idea of the Android shifting to using fragments in single activity instead of actual multiple activity sort of as a paradigm. So it's really, really changing how we think about things. Okay, so as far as the labs are concerned, the lab assignment there is going to ask you to go through, create something with that basic activity template. I don't really care what you call that project. If you haven't created it yet, call it basic activity, but just make sure it's under the 1.4 project. Because really all you're doing is just looking at the code. They'll ask you to do a little bit of modification on it. They'll ask you to change the name. This change here doesn't actually work anymore. I think one or two students was trying this yesterday and ended up turning it black instead of turning it to the darker purple, which it should have done. Again, it comes down to things that have changed. So that's related to this doesn't work anymore because they've changed how Team works in the past 2 years. And then they're asking you to do a little bit with here, just to change the, I think just to change the string that the FAB gives out. Yeah. Remove the FAB. Oh, they were having to remove the FAB. Okay. That's what's going on there. So, again, that's a place where we'll definitely look at it. The most important thing to pay attention to is just, kind of seeing what's there, seeing what it means to create a template. But the actual code in there is not going to make a lot of sense with most of these templates, because most of these templates do involve fragments in some way, shape, or form. Most of those templates do involve fragments in some way. Next up, so let's talk about the sample projects. One thing you can do, and this is basically from a learning perspective, that these are there. And you go back to Android Studio. If you're back at the main launcher here, let's say I want to use one of these samples. All of these samples are actually available on GitHub, so you can kind of look at the code there. But in order to bring it into your own project, I think, if I remember right, the new way to get here is new project. Oh, no, not new project. There it is. So on the top, you'll see that there's this triple dot. I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to say import an Android code sample. Okay, so that gets you to this long list. There are literally hundreds of these. There are literally hundreds of code examples that Google has written over the years that you can pull in from here. These are all sample projects. I think most of them work. Most of them work. A lot of times, some of these have been built recently and kept up to date. Some of these, just a fair forewarning, are very old. Some of the samples in here haven't been updated because, again, there's hundreds of them. So it's a decent place to look if you're curious at all about how to use certain features in Android. This will really get you into a lot of stuff that we will not cover this semester. There are a lot of concepts and pieces in here that we don't have anywhere near enough time to touch. Okay, so it's a place you can look. This is really more of a place that I would look if I was trying to learn something outside of class, right? Like if I want to learn about a concept that we're not covering in class, that's beyond the class, or later on that you want to go delve deeper, this is a decent place to look, go see some of the things that they built to demonstrate the features. This really won't help you much this semester, I will say. There's really not a lot of stuff in here that will help you with the projects that we're doing. Just putting that out there. Because the parts that we're interested in building we're not necessarily interested in getting into all the features of Android. We're really focused on what are the main skills that you need to understand and to build any sort of app. And it turns out that there aren't really any demos for that, right? There aren't very many demos for the main core concepts that we're really concerned about. I think there's a project in here too that uses Firebase, and so those things are interested in looking on. There's a few, I think, that play around with architecture components and things like that. But this is not the place that I would recommend looking if you're looking for information, right? So the lab is going to ask you to just pick one of the ones from here. I don't care which one you pick. Pull it in, create a project with it, and to kind of see how that code is. So if I just start with maybe the first one on one of these first ones about animations and bring that in. Maybe I'll start with basic transition, and this is just going to go into the 1.4 folder. Hit finish. Kind of like creating something with the template gives you basically a sample project. This is just a way to get maybe a more fleshed out sample project. It'll come in with a lot of code. You can see there's a README that's popping up initially that's telling us something about what this is. I would recommend, if you're looking at any of these samples, definitely take a look at the README, because it will explain a lot of what is it demonstrating and where you might want to look in the code to kind of understand what's going on. So it's going to take a little bit of time to come down. A, because it's downloading a bunch of stuff from GitHub. Also because it's going to be pulling in a version of Gradle that's older, so I haven't downloaded it yet, right? So more often than not, these will take a lot of time, especially the first time you pull down that sample, because it has to pull down a new version of Gradle. Give that a few moments. So we talked about how to make the icons. We kind of looked in there. I briefly showed you that there's also ways to get not just launcher icons, but other kinds of icons. We looked at that basic activity template a little bit, pulling down the sample project. One of the things that the lab mentions doing is pulling down the documentation for offline viewing. That is gone. It doesn't exist. There's no way to do that. So the only way to really view the documentation is online now. So that's a process that you can just skip because it's not there. There's no way to do it. Okay, this is almost done. Huh?
It's asking about plugins. It asked me about that too.
Yeah. So it's asking about project updated recommended. If you're going to try and use this, when you're trying to use this as a sample, I would not recommend updating this one. When you're pulling down a sample, I would not recommend updating the plugin. You're more likely to have problems if you do. Because my experience is some of these projects break as soon as you update the plugin. So keep it at whatever version it pulls down. You'll have the best luck. The main reason being here too is this really is just meant as a demonstration. This is not meant as, like, these samples are not meant to be pulled down and built on top of. They're not good for that. You're better off starting from scratch and building on top of a scratch project than trying to build on top of one of these. Because then you'll get the best practices rather than being kind of stuck with some of the older stuff.
So much there is.
Yeah, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of different resources to learn from. Right? There's a lot of different resources you can look up. But I'd say for the most part, the stuff that's really covered in 1.4 largely is stuff that's like, here's tools that you can learn when you're done with this class, right? More so than necessarily resources I would refer to while you're in this class. Okay, so we've got an example that runs now. You can see the different animations, and I could look into the code and kind of see how that works. Again, these are things you can learn from if you're interested in learning some more advanced topics. So where are we at on the agenda for today? So in terms of the agenda for today, we've looked at the launcher icons. We've looked at an activity template. I pulled down a sample project. Let's talk about Android developers. Okay, so the main resource that you'll want to refer to, both now and in the future, is go out to android.developers.com. Actually, I think I have that backwards. Let me go check my notes. Oh, developer.android.com. Yeah, I was backwards. So developer.android.com will get you to this website. This is really the home of where Google posts all of the documentation related to Android. There is a ton. There's a ton of stuff out there. There are a bunch of articles related to everything you ever want to know. Save this. It's going to be your best friend. This will definitely be your best friend because there's all sorts of things you can look up here. Okay. So let's say, for instance, I want to know about what's one of the concepts we talked about this week, maybe scroll view. So if I want to know anything about scroll view, I can just go to the search bar, type in scroll view, and lo and behold, I'm going to get a few articles about that, right? In fact, it'll take me to the whole documentation. Hey, here's the scroll view class. Anything you ever wanted to know about it, you can find out about here, okay? You can also find in there, I think there are maybe sometimes some articles. So, Android fundamentals, take you to a code lab. So I would really recommend, maybe bookmarking the Android developers webpage, the homepage, and having that be a place to go back and look to and read additional information about the stuff we are going to cover. Okay, cool. So in the stuff that's really in 1.4, this is the main place that you want to check, because this will get you to everything. Next up, I do want to point out one specific document. So if you go to developer.android.com/design, and this was linked in the reading material, you'll get to this page. Used to be a main tab on the developer's website, but now it's kind of more deeply nested. There's a few different pages here, quality guidelines as they call them, for different kinds of pieces. So like there's a page for just core apps, app quality. This page refers to any application you're building, large screens, gives you some pointers about specifically building for, say, TVs or other large screens. Where, if you're building for, say, smartwatches, again, TVs, cars, and I'm not entirely sure what this one is about. But the one I want to call to your attention is this page, is the core app quality checklist. This is worth a read, okay? What this gives you is a checklist of things that you want to check going through your app and making sure that it meets all the guidelines in terms of what's expected for the Play Store, what users expect for your app, and how it behaves, and common bugs that occur. So this is definitely a place to go look and to kind of be able to evaluate some things like, is your app got any bugs? This is a really good thing to pull as a checklist and check for. Cool. So it's subdivided into a few different sections. There's a section on visual experience. How does it look? How does the functionality work? Performance, privacy expectations, working with Google Play, testing, test procedures, etc. So you can see then here there's some checks like, hey, what about navigation? Well, okay, so things that need to work, like back navigation needs to work. Gestures as far as going back or going home screen, those things need to work, etc. So this is a good place to check and maybe save as a bookmark. Cool. Things to check and look as you're evaluating your applications. Questions? So that's kind of what I wanted to, just some of the things I wanted to tell you about, make you aware of. Questions? Thoughts? Okay. So that's all that's left on, that was all that was on my list. What I want you to do is, if you haven't finished 1.4, go ahead and go work through the 1.4 code lab. There's also the homework assignment. Once you finish that, you'll find that homework assignment under Inside Ranken. And then when you do finish 1.4, which I think some people have and you're likely to do today, you'll want to go on and start on the simple apps. You'll find this lab, Unit 2 Simple Apps. This will be your next lab assignment once you finish lesson 1.4. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to shut down